Did anybody answer the question, how much would you pay for a Super Bowl ticket? Did anybody say zero? How many of you would go to the Super Bowl if someone paid you to go? Okay. What if it was free? Who would go to the Super Bowl if you had a free ticket? Who's like, I wouldn't even go if I had a free ticket? Would anybody like to know what the cheapest Super Bowl ticket is? The cheapest Super Bowl ticket the other day that I looked up was $4,636. The cheapest ticket for a seat. Does anybody want to guess what the most expensive ticket is? Well, the truth is, you can't buy the best seats. But the best seats that are available, anybody want to guess? I heard 20 grand. $69,000. You know what you can buy for $69,000? I asked Kenny, I was like, hey, Kenny, you're like my car friend. What's the coolest car you can buy? He said you could buy a brand new Corvette for $69,000. Now that's pretty cool. Or like a Mercedes if you don't want like a muscle car. But I would imagine that if you're paying $69,000 for a Super Bowl ticket, you don't need a Corvette or a Mercedes. But you know what? Even just spending money on fun stuff just seems crazy right now. Like the way did anybody else's gas bill go up like crazy? So last month, our gas bill, we're getting real personal here. Our gas bill was $50. And this month it's $178. Anybody else having crazy bills? So here we are in the most expensive place in America, one of them, and in a recession with, money going up and down and all around. And I'm supposed to be talking about generosity. So it doesn't really seem to compute, but we're gonna do it anyways. We're gonna talk about it anyways. We've been going through our core values every single week. We're doing this series is called "This Is Who We Are," and we really believe strongly that there are things that God has called us to be as His followers. It's not really the Hills. I mean, this is our core values for the Hills, the organization. But we believe this is the core values of the church that God is building. So anybody want to try to take a stab at one of our core values? Just yell it out. I heard love is our motivation. I heard expand something. Expand the kingdom.
No one is disqualified.
Okay, if you've said one, don't say another one. I heard 3 from you, Liz. Let somebody else say one. I heard love is our motivation. I heard expand something. The kingdom of Jesus. We fight for relationships. Somebody else. We are willing to risk being known. No one is disqualified from being used by God. Dang. I didn't realize that this would create drama, but I kind of like it. I think we said them all, right? We expand the kingdom. No one is disqualified. Love is our motivation. We are willing to risk being known. We fight for relationship. And today, we do the most generous thing. So this is going to be a really easy message. You're just going to leave and you're going to be like, that was fine. It was easy. We do the most generous thing in the most expensive place with limited resources in a recession. Somehow, we do the most generous thing. So, and following Jesus is what we're trying to do. And the reason we say we do the most generous thing is because we're trying to follow Him. And so I want to take a second, and I want to read an article about what the economy was like in first century Israel, where Jesus lived. So if you've ever wondered, what was the money situation in Jesus' day? Here it is. You ready? The coming of the Roman Empire destroyed the community-based economy that God had provided for the children of Israel. The Roman Empire imposed exorbitant taxes, that just means very high taxes, on ordinary people. This pushed most families into poverty. If taxes could not be paid, their property would be confiscated. The tax collectors got rich, and the rest became tenant farmers or day laborers. For ordinary people, storing up wealth was impossible. Does that sound familiar? If the Roman soldiers found coins or grain hidden in a house, they would smash the house. Debt was used to impoverish people and steal their land. A person who was poor would be lent money at a very high interest rate, up to 50%, using their land as security. When they were unable to pay the interest or repay the loan, the interest would be added to the loan. In a few years, the small loan could grow to be worth more than the land that was given as security. The lender would demand the land to settle the debt. So by Jesus' time, most families in Israel had no land. They all just rented. Most of the land was controlled by a few powerful families and moneylenders. Tax collectors and soldiers would grab most of the crops that were grown and most of the money that was earned. The people were left with very little to live on. Most people were hungry most of the time. Many would have to find some work each day as a day laborer to buy their food. That is why Jesus knew the people had followed him all day around the lake to listen to him. They would be hungry, and if they had not worked, they would have no food and not be able to buy any. For the people of Israel, the Roman Empire was a terrible place to live. Land was concentrated in the hands of a few. Capital was no longer distributed evenly. The people did not have money to lend others because all surpluses were taken by the Romans and the temple system. Life was brutal and extreme poverty was normal. No wonder people were looking for a Messiah who would break the shackles of Rome and free them from the burden of debt, tax, and tribute. So do you kind of start to understand a little bit of their desperation? Like, everyone was in debt. It was impossible to buy a place. The government was taking too much. It kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? People are looking for hope. And so this guy comes around, and he doesn't actually come to the cities. He's out in the wilderness. And people are like, hey, could this be the Messiah? And so they go find him, and they find him. He's actually like dunking people in the water. And he's telling them to give their lives to God, and he's not very polite. So let's read what he says. Luke 3, starting in verse 7. John said to the crowds coming out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers." That wouldn't go over well today, would it? "Who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? Produce fruit in keeping with repentance. And do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our father.' For I tell you that out of these stones God can raise up children for Abraham. The axe is already at the root of the trees, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire." So spoiler alert, if you don't know, this guy John was actually not the Messiah. They thought he was the Messiah, but he wasn't. And people were still listening to him, and they knew they needed to change, and they were desperate because of the economy and because of their own needs, and they were probably a lot more desperate than 21st century Americans. They were a lot more broke than you. I don't care how broke you are. They were more broke than you. And they kind of thought, we've got this heritage, right? Like, I'm a descendant of Abraham, God's chosen one. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all that's who they put their hope in. And so he told them, he eliminated that hope in their bloodline. And so they were desperate. And I want to ask you, what do you do when you are desperate? And this may be a financial question. It may actually have nothing to do with finances. You may be desperate in another way. But I think people look for answers when they're desperate. And so I hope for you, whether it's financially, whether it's relationally, you find yourself desperate. Because when you're desperate, that's when you're open to try something new, to make a change. You will never make a change until the change of staying where you are outweighs the pain of changing. And so these people actually got to that place. They were desperate, they were broke, they were hopeless because John just crushed all their dreams that their bloodlines would save them. And so verse 10, here's what they say. That's what they say. What should we do? What should we do? That's a great place to be. I hope that coming to church, you have this posture every week. It's actually more like this. Right? Because you are not the ultimate authority. You don't know everything. I love this question. What should we do? I hope we find ourselves in this place where the crowd is. This crowd of people who thought that because they were Jewish, they were good to go. But John said, no, you're not. And so, you need to change. And for you, maybe it's not that you're Jewish. Maybe it's like your grandma's faith. That you kind of thought, well, my family, my grandma, my mom, or whoever was a person of faith. But it's actually not their faith that's going to save you. So what do? I like this feeling that you can actually do something about it, A lot of people think that faith is about empty platitudes and philosophy. And those things are good. But faith is not just about my beliefs. It's about action. And that's what John was about to show them. In verse 11, John said, anyone who has 2 shirts should share with one who has none. And anyone who has food should do the same. Pretty simple, right? John knew these people didn't have much. And so he didn't tell them, give away everything you have. He just says, if you have 2 of something, just give one of them away. It's really practical. And so then we realize that the tax collectors, who, if you know anything about the first century, the tax collectors were kind of the traitors. Because the Jewish people, they had this wealth. They had like everything that God provided for them. And the tax collectors worked for the Roman Empire to like get money from their own people. The tax collectors were Jewish, and they were getting money from their own people, and they were giving it to the Roman government, and all the Jewish people hated tax collectors. And tax collectors got rich by taking more money than the government actually told them to take. And so they were already leaning in. Out in the wilderness, it wasn't just Jewish people like that were non-tax collectors. There were tax collectors there with them, and so they had already been leaning in. And then it says, verse 12, even the tax collectors came to be baptized. You know the Jewish people did not like this. Teacher, they asked, what should we do? They had the same posture. What should we do? And John tells them in verse 13, don't collect any more than you are required to, he told them. Then some soldiers. There weren't just tax collectors and regular Jewish people. There were even soldiers who had been listening in too. And you'll notice the soldiers don't get baptized. They're just like, hey, what should we do? They had the same posture. This is a great place to be. What should we do? He replied. Don't extort money and don't accuse people falsely. Be content with your pay. And I think that the soldiers probably looked around at each other and they were like, okay, we can't argue with this. Extortion is obtaining money through threats. I think we all know that's wrong, to obtain money through threats. Anybody think that false accusations are a good idea? No, the soldier's like, okay, he's right. We shouldn't extort people. We shouldn't make false accusations. We should just be content with what we have. And so I want to notice, just really quick, before we move on to another passage, John didn't tell all 3 groups, the crowd of Jewish people, the tax collectors, and the soldiers, he didn't tell them all the same thing. He had a different design for each of them in their generosity. And I want to tell you, you don't have to copy and paste what somebody else does or feel guilty if you're not doing what someone else does. God has a specific plan for your generosity. Isn't that freeing? You don't have to do what everyone else does. And you know what? You can't judge anybody if they don't do the same thing you do. God has a specific plan for your generosity. And so I was listening to this pastor. His name is Rick Warren. Anybody ever heard of Rick Warren? He wrote the top-selling nonfiction American book in history. It's called The Purpose-Driven Life. Great book if you've never read it. He decided to start living on 1% less of his income and giving away every year. And so now he's down to living on 9% of his income. Can I tell you I'm not going to live on 9% of my income? If so, I would be inviting myself over to your house, and then I would be saying, can we have a sleepover? Because we can't pay rent. We're living on 9%. I don't think that's a good idea. So God has a specific plan for your generosity. And so that's why we say, for you and for me, our goal and our value is we do the most generous thing. And you may hear and think about what John just told those 3 groups and say, you know what, that's not really the most generous thing. And you're right. Because a few chapters later, Jesus comes. And he just wrecks shop on everything John just said. So we're going to skip forward to Luke 6. I want to read this passage. Jesus talking about generosity, and it's way more than you think it's going to be. So just prepare for this. Luke 6, we're going to start in verse 27. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Ouch. Bless those who curse you. Oof. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to them the other also. You ever heard that statement? I'm going to turn the other cheek. That's where this comes from. Let them slap the other cheek. I hate this advice, but this is Jesus talking. If someone takes your coat, takes it. Do not withhold your shirt from them. Ugh. Give to everyone who asks of you. That's a tough one. Everyone who asks of you. And if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Americans do not live like this, do we? Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies. Do good to them and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Listen to this last part. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. That last little part where it says, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. I was talking to my wife, Amy, who is an amazing baker. If you've never had any of her baked goods. Yeah, come on, you can clap. You got it, girl. So she said whenever you do flour or like a powder, you're not supposed to like shake it or pack it because it messes up the recipe. And so what God is saying is He's going to shake it up, He's going to pack it in, and it's going to be pouring over your lap. That's a pretty good promise, right? Somebody say amen to that. So, but before we get to what He's going to do for us, I just want you to notice the generosity of Jesus. The generosity of Jesus is just all-encompassing. Do you hear how many topics He touched in that passage? It's overwhelming. He wants you to be generous with your love, with your forgiveness. He wants you to be generous and not judging people, not condemning people. He wants you to be generous with every resource you have, even what you wear. He wants to be generous even when people take stuff from you. He wants you to be generous with what you think people owe you. It's too much. You can't bear this burden. The generosity of Jesus is all-encompassing, and I think on our own it leaves us hopeless. But then Jesus, He kept going in His life. And He did the unthinkable. He gave the most precious gift that anyone could ever give. Jesus did the most generous thing for you and me on the cross to the least deserving people. So when it says love your enemies, what He's saying is, He's saying, hey, watch how I love you. You who actually are an enemy of God because of your rebellion. Jesus did the most generous thing, and you didn't deserve it, but He decided you were worth it. You know why? Why did Jesus do the most generous thing? Why would He do that? Because He loves you. Jesus did the most generous thing because He loves you. And that frees us up, right? I mean, your life, just think about it, your whole life exists because of the generosity of God. You don't deserve anything. God gave you your body. That's God's generosity. Every breath you take is God's generosity. Every beat of your heart is generosity from God. Every penny you've ever gotten, every relationship, your friends, your family, it's all God's generosity. And then on top of that, even though you took this life that He gave you and you rebelled against His design, He said, I don't care, I love Him too much. And so Jesus came down and He taught about this generosity, and then He lived it and He displayed the generous love of God up on the cross. And they saw the generosity of Jesus, making us God's kids. When you experience that, when you experience the generosity of Jesus, it frees you up to do the most generous thing. But it only works if you come from a place of, I know I don't deserve it. And so let me tell you, if you kind of think you've earned something from God, if you think you've earned something that you have in your life, if you think you've earned the right to, not be generous, you will never embody the generosity of Jesus. The generosity of Jesus can only be given from a place of, I have had the generosity of God poured out on me every second of my life. And from that place, that's the only way that you don't get crushed by the calling of Jesus. Because it's all encompassing. And so I believe that if you look through this passage, I'm only going to say 3 of the ways Jesus is calling us to be generous. There's like 15, but we're going to just do 3 right now. Number 1, Jesus is calling you and me to be generous with forgiveness. Jesus wants you to be generous with your forgiveness. It is simply impossible to forgive without being forgiven from God. And so if you think you are fine, you will never be able to be generous with forgiveness. That's why the Pharisees sucked. Can I say suck at church? I'm saying it. The Pharisees sucked at forgiveness because they didn't think they needed to be forgiven. They thought they had it all. They kept 613 religious laws vigorously. They thought they earned it. And so when they saw that tax collector, that sinner, that prostitute, they judged them hard. And that's what you and I will do if you think you've earned it from God. But if you've received the forgiveness of God, you can forgive. And if you don't be generous with forgiveness, it negates all other generosity. So like if I'm mad at my wife for something that she did, and then I make her a sandwich, I'm like, here, but I'm still mad at you about what I did. Did I negate the generosity? Yeah, how much did the sandwich mean? Nothing, because I didn't forgive her. When you withhold forgiveness, all other generosity doesn't count. It doesn't work. And so doing something that you may think, okay, I'm mad at them, but if I do something nice for them, that kind of levels the playing field. No, doing something nice for someone does not equal generosity and forgiveness. You actually have to let it go. And so be generous with your forgiveness. Number 2, be generous with your resources. Now, when I say do the most generous thing, this is probably what you think, right? Like, I'm supposed to be generous with my money, right? This is kind of the first thing we think of. And that's actually, that's what Jesus said. He said, not just giving your money, but anything, literally anything, the shirt off your back. Mike Eulig told me a story the other day about how when he was in college, he and his friends were trying to do something. I love how he said it. They're trying to attack materialism. And so they all went, him and his roommates, they went into their closet and they found their favorite shirt, which Mike confessed it wasn't actually his favorite shirt, but it was like one of his favorite shirts. And they went and they gave it away because you're trying to attack materialism, right? Doing the most generous thing. So, and money matters because money is a good indicator of what you value. Because chances are you can buy a lot of the things that you value with money. And so, and Jesus is he makes it so hard because he says, don't just give to people you love. Sometimes it's easy to give to people you love. For you, maybe you're like, no, I don't even want to give to them. But Jesus said you got to give to the people you love and to the people you don't love. Even the people that take advantage of you. Has anyone here heard a sob story that you just straight up did not believe? Most of us probably, right? Jesus is like, that dude that's trying to take advantage of you, give to him. I'm like, oh no, he doesn't deserve it. But then I'm like, oh yeah, I don't deserve it. But then Jesus goes beyond just giving to people you love, right? He says, give to the people who beg, borrow, and steal. Which is really hard because then it leads to the third thing. First, you're being generous with your forgiveness. The second is you're being generous with resources. The third one is this. Be generous with what people owe you. And that's tough because we don't think about this when we think about generosity, but when you lend something to someone and then they lose it or they break it or they forget to give it back to you, that's kind of frustrating, right? I don't like giving something to someone and then they just lose it or they forget about it or they break it. And then the funny thing is when they do break it, They can't afford to get it fixed, because if they could afford to get it fixed, they would have just been able to afford to buy it in the first place, and that's why they borrowed it from me. Right? Jesus is saying, even when they borrow it, and they break it, or they steal it, not only do you forgive them for what they did, but you are generous with what they owe you, which is like just forgiving. You're forgiving in two ways, right? You're forgiving the offense, and you're forgiving the debt. And that's what Jesus did for us. Not only does he forgive the offense, he pays the debt you owe with what you've done. This is the gospel. The gospel is you don't deserve the love and grace and favor of God, but Jesus said, I'm going to do the most generous thing. Jesus gave his life, the most valuable thing, the greatest resource in the history of the universe. The life of Jesus was given. And when you pay the debt, when you forgive the debt, you show people his love. So I'm almost done. I quickly want to tell us and remind us. Here's what will happen if we do the most generous thing. Being generous with our forgiveness, with our resources, with what people owe us. This is like a top 10 list. You ready? Top 10 reasons to do the most generous thing. Number 1, I position myself to receive the blessings of God. That's a good one. When you do the most generous thing, you position yourself to receive the blessings of God. I am shorter than most NFL players. I'll just tell you that right now. I'm 5'11". For a long time, I lied on my driver's license and I said I was 6 foot because I thought I would get there, but I never did, and so I'm 5'11". But there's a football player that has won the Super Bowl 3 times, and he was even the NFL, he was the MVP of the Super Bowl. Did anybody know who I'm talking about? He's 5'9", he's shorter than me. Anybody know who I'm talking about? Nobody? Man. Julian Edelman. He's 5'9", Super Bowl MVP in 2019. Do you know why he is so good? It's about the route running. He runs routes so well, and you know what he does? Listen to this. He is so good at positioning himself to receive. Do you catch that? The number 1 reason, I mean, it's not like ranked in importance, but the first reason to do the most generous thing is because you position yourself to receive the blessings of God when you do the most generous thing. Number 2, I want to read a verse about that too. Psalm 112:5 says, good will come to those who are generous and lend freely. And that's good. Number 2, I acknowledge what God has given to me is enough. When you do the most generous thing, you're saying, I don't have to keep it all, because what God has given to me is enough. Have any parents in the room? How much do you want to hear your kids say, I can be generous with what you've given me, because what you've given me is enough? That's hard, isn't it? But that's real truth. Like, what God has given to me is enough. Psalm 30, verses 8 and 9 says, give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, who is the Lord? Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of my God. I acknowledge that what God has given to me is enough. Number 3, I expand my influence. Now, this is different than just becoming famous. Some people get famous for being generous. I don't want to be famous, but I believe that when you and I do the most generous thing, it expands our influence. Proverbs 11:24 says, one person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. I love the paraphrase, the message. It says this, the world of the generous gets larger and larger. The world of the stingy gets smaller and smaller. Isn't that so counterintuitive? If I think I keep it, I think I'm going to have more. But actually, if I give it, my world grows, my influence grows. And here's the thing, the next one is, not only do I expand my influence when I do the most generous thing, I expand the kingdom of Jesus. Because I am prioritizing the things of God with my resources, with my forgiveness, with what people owe me. And I'm saying, listen, I want to expand the kingdom of Jesus. Every time I get paid, it's a reminder that I'm giving to expand the kingdom of God, because the first thing I give is a tithe. And this message actually isn't even about tithing. But whenever I tithe 10% of what I'm bringing in, it's like saying, I know that I'm giving towards expanding your kingdom, Jesus. And you may say something like, well, how do I know that this church is expanding the kingdom of Jesus? If you don't think this church is expanding the kingdoms, stop coming. Go find a church that you believe is expanding the kingdom of Jesus. We believe the way we do that, the way we expand the kingdom of Jesus, is by building meaningful relationships and being disciples who make disciples. So we expand the kingdom of Jesus one changed life at a time. And that's what we're all about here. So if you want to give to something that expands the kingdom, I believe this church is a really great candidate. And it doesn't have to just be this church. It's any organization. And then really, here's the really magical part. When you give to an individual and you have a relational opportunity to expand the kingdom of Jesus, that is so powerful. And so it's not just about being generous to organizations. It's about being generous to organizations and to individuals. Number 5, when I do the most generous thing, my faith grows. You know, anybody here have kids, or maybe you were a kid? You remember? Absolutely, you were a kid at one point. Some of you seemed like maybe you never were, but you all were to some degree. Do you remember being on the edge of the pool and your parent was right there, and you had to jump to them? The first time was the hardest, wasn't it? The second time is easier, because once you jump in, you're like, oh, they got me. The first time being generous is always the hardest one, because once you do something generous and you see that God's got me, I can't tell you, there are countless, maybe even thousands of stories just in the last 14 years that Amy and I have been married, where we will give something and it feels like, oh, this is a lot. Not a lot of money, just feels like a lot to us, because we have 4 kids, 1 income, live in Southern California, just like you. But the second time is always easier. And so when you're generous, not only does it build your faith, but it fuels your faith, and it takes faith. And so every step of generosity takes faith, but then you grow in faith. And so your faith grows when you are generous. Number 6, when I do the most generous thing, I honor God. I honor God. Giving the most generous thing shows honor to God because it doesn't come after my needs. I'm honoring God before I take care of my own needs. That's what doing the most generous thing does. Number 7, I love this one. When I do the most generous thing, I draw close to God. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And when I give to the things of God, my heart is in the things of God. And I want to be close to God. And when I let go of something and my faith grows and I honor God and I expand His kingdom, it's like I actually grow closer through my generosity. I grow closer relationally to God. Number 8, when I do the most generous thing, I show the world the love of Jesus. This is the greatest privilege in the world, because you know what Jesus did on that cross? He showed the world the love of the Father. The most famous Bible verse in history is John 3:16. For God so loved that He gave His only Son, and whoever believes in Him will not perish, but will have everlasting life. So when you are generous, you show somebody the love of Jesus. Number 9, when I do the most generous thing, I actively push back against the love of money. Come on, who wants to push back against the love of money? That materialism, go get your favorite shirt out of the closet like Mike did. Come on, let's push back against the love of money. May money never be something that we cling to. May we cling to Jesus and His purposes and His plan and His kingdom. We push back actively against the love of money. Matthew 6:24, Jesus said, no one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. By the way, if you hear someone say money is the root of all evil, that's not true. Jesus never said that. Jesus said the love of money is the root of all evil. And so when you push back against the love of money, you are pushing back against the darkness. You're pushing back against evil. And the last one, this is my favorite one. When you do the most generous thing, you experience joy. This is a really fun part of being a Jesus follower. As the pastor of this church, I've had really amazing opportunities. Besides time that God's called me and my family to be generous, this church, you guys, you have given away thousands of dollars. And I get to be the one to give it most of the time. We give it to missionaries. We give money to church planters. We give money to organizations that are expanding the kingdom of Jesus. We give money to people in need. We give money to kids who need clothes. It is so fun. We gave away a car. We're about to share that story. You think that wasn't fun? It is fun to be generous. It fuels your joy. You experience joy when you are generous. And I want us to experience that joy together. And so this is the last message in this series. This is who we are. Next week we're starting a new series. And I want to see us really do the most generous thing. The series is called Helping the Next Gen Win. And so we want to do the most generous thing. We want to put our money where our mouth is for the next generation. We've got some really amazing things, some initiatives that I believe are going to make a difference in kids' lives. And I want to ask you, we're not taking an offering for that today, but I do want to ask you to pray about what God is going to lead you to give. And we're going to do a 4-month fundraiser for the next generation. And you're going to be giving towards things like Hills Kids Camp. We're about to do our 3rd year of camp. Last year, we went from 30 attending to 75 in attendance. This year, we're praying and making a goal of seeing 100 people be part of Hills Kids Camp. We're giving to some student activities called After Hours, where we collaborate with other churches and we bring kids together for a safe and fun night where you see that Jesus is really fun and really awesome and have tons of fun with other students. We're going to be collaborating with all kinds of city leaders to do a mental health night. Because not only is mental health important for spiritual health, we believe, the schools believe it's important for academic health, and businesses want to help with mental health. We all want to come together, and we want to help coordinate that. And so we're going to have a mental health night. And then in the fall, we're going to have a back-to-school Sunday, and we're planning on doing another big Vans shoe drive. We invite everyone out and give them a brand new pair of Vans right before the school year starts. Don't you love the thought of kids who can't get new shoes, getting some new shoes? And so we're raising $30,000 over the next 4 months to help the next gen win. And we're going to start that series next week. And so join us next week. And before we go today, we have a really, really special story. So Mike, come on up here. Can I just pray to finish our message and to pray over what we are going to give today? We're not doing the next gen offering until next week, but I do want to invite you to give because I believe that God is using this church to expand the kingdom of Jesus. And the stories that we see every week are proof of it. And so thank you for giving. Thank you so much for positioning yourself to receive the blessings of God with the Hills Community Church. Thank you so much for experiencing joy with the Hills Community Church. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much that you give us everything we need. I pray that we would be content. I pray that we would give generously. I pray that we would see your kingdom expand and even our own influence expand. And that we would experience the joy that comes from being generous and letting go and trusting you, and that our faith would just explode. Thank you that you are all about changing our lives, and we get to hear about that even right now. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.